One of the things I do when I've been giving my speeches in recent months and last year or so is to stress to people, we started the winter season in 2008, just like I forecast back in the late 80s, early 90s, ever since I started my newsletter and wrote my first book, that the winter season was set for 2008 to 2023 approximately. And again, we did start that. Now, recent evidence, David Stockman, who's going to be speaking at our IES conference in October this year in Washington, D.C., he just pointed out that if you compare 1929, the top, through 1940, considered kind of the bottom of the Great Depression and in the 1930s, the biggest setback in U.S. history, that the cumulative real GDP for that 11-year period was 20% real GDP. So like less than 2% a year. Well, guess what it is from 2007, the top of the last boom, through this whole slow growth period was 19%. Slightly less in the same 11-year period. In other words, our real GDP just did slightly worse than the Great Depression. Now, here's the big difference there, though. In the Great Depression, I'm going to talk about this next Thursday and show more data on this. In the Great Depression, obviously, we had a super big crash to start. 2008 started off that way. It looked just like 1930, the crash and stuff, and major companies failing and all that sort of stuff. Financial and General Motors and AIG. Lehman Brothers finally goes under, and then quantitative easing came in. So what we had, the difference is, in the early 30s, we had the big crash and debt deleveraging right off the bat. Then we had a strong recovery, unlike this weak recovery. And then we had a second deleveraging and deflationary period and a recession, kind of depression. So what I see this time is we had a smaller, even though a very deep recession, near depression, 2008-9. A very slow recovery despite $12 trillion being printed globally and $4 trillion in the U.S. and now tax cuts from Trump and everything. With all of this massive, unprecedented stimulus, we still did no better in cumulative GDP than the Great Depression. But what I see is we still have the worst to come. The big crash will come on the back end of this one between 2020 and 2022, and probably with a hangover in the economy till 2023. So we still have our winter season, 2008 to 2023. We get a smaller crash and deep downturn at the beginning, strong recovery, and now a deeper downturn, more like 1930 to 32 and 33 at the end. So we're going to end up altogether, when we calculate this and when this happens in the next few years, worse than the Great Depression. So we have seen this winter season. It's just been muted. Think of it as a muted winter season thus far, still deflationary in nature because all this stimulus would have created massive inflation any other time in our cycle, especially the 70s, which is already inflationary prone. We only have 0 to 2% inflation in major countries around the world. Nobody can even get up to 2% except for us barely, despite massive stimulus. So we're in a deflationary environment, very low GDP growth for a decade plus, and we won't come out of this until at least 2023 forward. So now other thing, and I'm going to talk about this in Monday's Economy and Markets, our debt. Unlike the 1930s, where we deleveraged massive amounts of private debt, even though, of course, government debt always goes up in a downturn like that. Well, our debt has gone from, like 57 trillion at the peak in late 2008, early 2009, to 77 trillion. Government debt has grown the fastest. It's more than doubled the government debt, and then there's state and local and agency debt and stuff too. And corporate debt has grown very substantially, 30, 40%. Consumer debt's about what it was in 2008-9. Financial debt, the most leveraged back then, is just a little bit lower, but that was crazy back then. The fact that we've gone through this partial deleveraging and long, slow growth, and we still have financial debt nearly as high, that's a bad sign. So we have more debt than ever. I'm going to cover that on Monday's Economy and Market. And in Thursday's economies market, and I'll look more at the details of how slow did growth get versus the 30s. Where are we going from here? And I think we're going to see the same thing we saw in the early 30s, an actual negative reading on a 10-year rolling average for real GDP growth for the first time, way worse than the 70s and more like the 30s depression. So we are in the winter season. It's just happening in reverse this time. And we're going to get the worst at the end instead of the beginning. And that is coming in the next 2, 3, 4 years max. And I think we're going to be over it by then. And I think you're going to get quick reforms after people see that massive money printing and tax cuts at the top of a boom did not work. I think reforms will come quicker like they did in the mid-30s on, and we'll be pulling out of this because the demographics start to get better, first in the U.S., but also around the emerging world. So again, very interesting times, but don't think. A lot of people at places I've been speaking and just at this recent Tony Platt group saying, oh, well, we've had an extended fall season. Well, that's one way to look at it. No, we've had a muted winter season and the worst is about to come. Stay tuned.